In this training session, we're going to take a look at event log filters with a focus on the content filter part of these filters. So what do I mean and what can we do with that? So let's take a look at some of the filters that come with EventSentry. So we have the EventSentry Alerts event log package. And let's take a look at this filter here called Excluded Services. So we're already familiar with this part of the filters where we basically say, okay, we're applying this to the application event log. Only errors, these are event IDs. We're specifying a range here plus an additional event ID. And that can be sufficient in many cases when you want to apply your rule to any event, no matter what the actual content, the message of the event says. But in some cases, we have to be a little bit more granular. We have to look at the actual content of the filter. So that could apply to security event logs if we want to include or exclude an event based on a username or on a process, on a computer name, or in this case, the name of a service. And that's where the content filter comes in. So the content filter allows you to basically filter based on the message in a variety of ways. And the first thing you'll notice is that we have this text here that says text number 1 matches on the left side under type. But let's take a look to see, what does that mean? So if we double click, we can edit existing entries and we're presented with this sub dialog here. And let's analyze this dialog from the top to bottom. So the first thing that we can choose is the text match type. So here it's set to insertion string match, insertion string number 1 and matches. There's also the option to specify a wildcard and regex pro syntax. What's an insertion string match? Well, before we go into that, why don't we take a look at a more basic way to filter this? Because another way to filter this event based on the service name would simply be to do a wildcard match and right here, print notify, and add it like this. So if you look at the bottom now, it will say wildcard print notify. Would serve more or less the same purpose, but is handled a little differently and a little bit less efficiently. When we enter a wildcard filter, then what EventSentry does is it essentially parses the entire message of the event and checks to see whether this text appears, this wildcard matches. Depending on the length of the text, that can be a little bit inefficient, and depending on the text itself, the text may appear in different parts of the event. So you may have to add a little bit more, like add text before or after the wildcards and so forth. However, this is the easiest way to match the content of an event is you simply set this to wildcard match, enter the text that you want to match, and you're done. I'm going to remove this again, and I'm going to go back up here and explain the insertion strings. To understand insertion strings, we first have to understand how the majority of events are actually logged to the event log. So again, we double click this, and this time I'm going to click the preview button here. And looking at this here, you can see that there's all the event logs and event sources are registered here. And EventSentry automatically selected the event that we're looking at here, the first one, 10-100. So if we go down here, we can see all the events that EventSentry is essentially logging. And here we can actually see the template of this event that EventSentry logs. You can see here that instead of logging the actual message of the service status change, there's actually a template that's being utilized. And that's pretty much used by almost all events that are logged to the event log. And that allows Windows to support things like the localization. So there could be a template in German and Spanish and whatnot, where the running application that logs the event essentially just inserts dynamic strings. And that's why we call them insertion strings. So we can see here that it says the status of service %1 changed from %3 to %4. But let's take a look at the actual event or one of the events that's being logged by EventSentry when a service status changes. This is not the same service. This is the AppX SVC, another service that is essentially changes its status often and does not need to get monitored. But the point here is I kind of overlaid the actual event template here in orange, and you can see here what the actual event looks like with the dynamic data inserted and what the template looks like. So you can see here the key name here is insertion string number 1. So that's the name of the service, not the display name of the service, but the actual internal name of the service. Sometimes they're very similar, sometimes they're very different. For example, the print spooler in Windows has a display name of print spooler, but the key name is just spooler. XSVC appears twice here, as we can see in the template. So it says here the status of servers %1. It appears up here. Then we have the display name, so that's what you see when you open up the services application in Windows, AppX deployment service. That shows up there again. And then we have the status changing from running to stopped, so that's %3 and %4. Then we have the executable as %6, the startup type as well here, and also the service account. So this is running under the local system account. But back to the management console. So here, I'm going to close this. So what we're doing here is we're just checking the key name of the service and doing the comparison just with that one string. So the advantage being the whole text is a little bit cleaner. We don't have to use the asterisk symbols. And the matching is usually going to be faster because EventSentry doesn't have to parse the entire text message, which can be very long. Instead, it's just strictly looking at that first insertion string that's embedded with the event. And if we look at some of the other filters here, we'll see that there's potentially different strings. So here we all have number 1. Here we have number 5. So again, looking at a different event here, 10.151. If we click on lookup here, we'll see here that a driver was added. And we're looking at insertion string number 5. And insertion string number 5 is the executable. So here we're not matching the key name, but we're matching the executable. And that's because the key name for this service is dynamic, changes a lot. But we're basically here saying if the executable matches this pattern here, so this a .sys file in this folder, well then this filter should match and exclude it from triggering an alert. And in addition to a wildcard and an insertion string match, and we're going to look at these options here in a little bit, you can also do a regex match. So this just allows you, this is very similar to the wildcard match. Regex matches are usually a little more CPU intensive. This allows you to do a bit more of a granular match against the text because regex supports a lot more than just asterisks and the question mark characters. You can look for spaces, specific number patterns and so forth. Look for credit card numbers, IP addresses, and so forth. So if you need to do that, then you can use the regex syntax. I'm going to now look at a different package that also ships with EventSentry that employs similar things here. So there's a PowerShell security package here that has a number of rules to detect malicious PowerShell activity. And what you'll see here, and this is new in some of the new versions of EventSentry, here we're actually resolving the name of the insertion string to make it a little bit easier to read. So if the event template supports a descriptive name of each field, so if you click the preview icon here, preview button here, we'll see a similar template again, just like we did earlier. We have %8, %9, for example, for the command line. However, EventSentry resolves that name automatically and shows you this right here, so you'll see exactly what the name of that insertion string is instead of just seeing the number, and it also limits only to the number of insertion strings that are actually available for this specific event. But the rest is the same. We're just matching based on a specific string. They're all quite similar there. Here's a regex pattern that I was talking about earlier. So in this case, we're looking at very specific character occurrences in the string, and you can only do that with a regex, of course. But let's take a look at some of the additional options that are available for insertion string matching. I'm not going to go into every one of them, but I'm going to give you a brief overview. So we created this filter in another training video. So if you're going to an insertion string match, the first option is matches, but there's actually a few more options that we have available here. The documentation explains all of these, but once EventSentry looks at a specific insertion string of an event, then that insertion string can represent a lot of different things depending on the context of this event. So in the early example, the first one we looked at with the service, it was the name of the service. But another one that we looked at was a path to the file of the service. That was for the Defender update. And yet another one that we looked at with the PowerShell filters was a command line. So depending on what that string represents, we can do other matches, other types of comparisons. So the first one being file matches checksum. So if the insertion string in the event that you're looking at represents or points to a file name, then you can actually put a file checksum right here in this field, and EventSentry will do the comparison. So it will basically create the checksum on the fly for this file and then compare it with the checksum that you've put here. So in this case, you would just put a SHA 256 checksum here and you could do the comparison. Member of a group. So this setting will interpret the insertion string as a username and check whether that username is a member of the group specified. So for example, if the insertion string is a username, so that could apply to a logon event, a process launch 4688 event. And let's say you wanted to know if a user that is a member of the local administrators group launched that process or logged onto the computer, then you would simply write administrators here. And then EventSentry would enumerate the members of that administrators group and see if that string is a member of that. Less than, more than, equal to, not equal to, is empty, is not empty. So the first ones here would apply to numbers. So if the insertion string represents just any numerical number, integer, then you could simply say if it's less than. So if you have a numerical alert, for example, about a temperature, a CPU usage, or whatever it may be, you could say, well, if it's less than 50, then I want to get an alert. The same goes with more than, equal to, not equal to, and so forth. Is empty, not empty. So sometimes you have situations where you want to get an alert if a specific insertion string simply doesn't exist. Then we have file entropy. So EventSentry can, so again, if that insertion string points to a file name, then EventSentry can calculate the file entropy, which is the randomness of the file. And then you can do a calculation based on that. So that would be a good way to determine, okay, is this, for example, a compressed file, encrypted file? And then with other features in EventSentry, you could potentially detect a ransomware attack that way. If it's a IP address, then you can also check to see if that IP address is considered malicious. So especially if you're using a collector, then you can do that. Then you can count the command line arguments. So for example, if you're monitoring a 4688 event that logs the command line parameters, and we're pointing this to the command line argument, I think it was 9, then you could basically say, okay, if it's fewer than 2 arguments, then that's a problem. The reason why it exists is there's some ways to exploit commands if you're using fewer or more than a certain number of arguments, depending on the context, of course. So that pretty much sums up the capabilities of the content filter. So definitely a little bit more of an advanced topic, but it gives you a lot of flexibility when it comes to filtering events, especially when you start utilizing insertion strings and applying some of these advanced checks, like is the user a member of a group, counting command line arguments, doing numerical comparisons, creating file checksums, and so forth.